Begin with a brief presentation.
Oh, thank you. Tyler, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Tyler. And just stop me whenever my time is up.
Okay.
It's okay.
I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Oh, that's good. I wasn't sure what exactly to center on anyway, but Christina, who asked me to talk, had said something about it's okay if I talk about what I do. And
Yes, certainly.
she said the theme was something about building a practice or a successful practice. Is that okay? So just I wrote some stuff up and I'll just summarize it. But before I do that, just about my own trajectory. I think it was very helpful to work in hospital settings, both state psychiatric and city psychiatric units. It really helped me learn a great deal, particularly at the state hospital where you were able to spend a lot of time with people. They were there for years, and so I saw people sometimes 5 times a week for years, the same person. So it really was quite a helpful experience. Doing training I trained in CBT when I was working at a hospital in the South Bronx, and I wasn't so impressed. I didn't get impressed by CBT until I travel a lot with the ISBS group. My colleagues in England and in Netherlands, and you know, I think what they're doing with with people with psychotic symptoms is really exemplary. But anyway, I'm glad I trained as an analyst. It was very helpful to me. And of course, your own personal therapy is very important. Supervision, being in study groups, peer support groups or peer supervision groups I found very helpful over the years. Being on listservs that are active, professional listservs, a lot of exchange of knowledge, information, resources. Okay. So anyway, besides all that, our hearts are educated by the suffering of the other, being open to it, and our own suffering as well. Our hearts cannot be educated by ourselves. So to have empathy and identification with the suffering of the other is a cornerstone of the psychotherapeutic approach of the group I belong to, ISBS, which is an international mental health organization. It's important to enter into the mystery of the suffering of ourselves and the other. Our human condition is characterized by vulnerability, dependency, and suffering, as well as great strength and resilience. We need to offer caring attention to the marginalized among us. They become our teachers. Our humanity is a potentiality we develop, especially in our encounters with the suffering other. An old African proverb says, I am sick in my sister, or I am sick in my brother. By this they meant the suffering one should be seen as part of oneself. This communal self, this communal social aspect of self, as opposed to the Western models, conceptualizations of self that are so individualistic and counter-dependent. The marginalized are needed by us to be integrated into our human community. I'm reminded of Martin Buber's comment, all real living is meeting. My friend, who's now deceased, a Finnish psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, Marty Sirla, spoke of the existential loneliness and placelessness of those diagnosed with severe mental illness. In the daily work with people with severe psychiatric problems, voices, delusions, etc., I'm reminded of the words of Harry Stack Sullivan, God save me from any analysis that goes well. There's always a bumpy road. And Carl Jung, who proposed that unless the patient and therapist become problems for each other, there's no real therapy or emotional engagement taking place. Besides the psychoanalytic training and experience that's been very helpful to me personally and professionally, I've been deeply influenced by social and affective neuroscience. My early research in the 70s was in neuroendocrinology of stress in a medical disorder, diabetes type 1. And since then, I've been studying at various places, social and affective neuroscience. And I particularly like affective neuroscience because it centers on human emotion and the affective infrastructure of our minds. I like the emphasis on emotion and understanding deep emotion and defenses against emotion, anxiety, in particular separation anxiety. I'm not going to go into the different subcortical, in the question and answer period, if anyone's interested, we can talk about that and some of the research that's been very helpful in terms of understanding therapeutic action in the work we do. I'd like to just say that inevitably there are enactments. If you're doing long-term work where you're really engaged with the individual, I don't use the word patient anymore, therapeutic partner, and inevitably there's going to be enactments on the part of the therapist, on the part of the therapeutic partner. And it's important to understand these emotional enactments and to work them through, and to understand where the patient's coming from. The countertransference is so central, I think. It's a portal into understanding what's dissociated in the individual you're working with, what needs to be integrated into a relationship that can contain the unbearable affect. So the work is quite hard at times, but it pays off. It's a very rich experience. Because psychoanalysis has such a bad name, what I do in the publications and some of the projects I'm involved with, I call it relational psychosis psychotherapy, having been trained at the NYU postdoc where relational psychoanalysis really took root. It seemed like a natural fit. And the goal is to help people facilitate their being able to form secure attachments, but in particular because so many of our patients are relationally traumatized in one way or another, most of us are, it's not easy to form a secure, close emotional relationship. For many people, secure attachments signify abandonment or being colonized or controlled or invaded, having their ego boundaries invaded, or fears of being victimized. So you have to be able to be tuned into that and into your own countertransference reactions to it, of course, and to help people to be, I see emotional health as basically being able to maintain relative good enough cohesion of the self when you're in a close emotional relationship with someone else. And so that's basically what I do and try to help people with. It's been very rich experience seeing people with severe psychiatric symptoms get better, and and often it takes years, but I've had a good experience of seeing people recover a viable life, and not everyone, but over the years, a number of people, and the deep emotional relationships that are formed from doing that work are quite sustaining. Friendship doesn't quite accurately describe the kind of relationship you develop when you're working with someone 20 years or more. I try to see people 3 to 5 times a week. Medicare pays for it. Not the managed care Medicare, they often give you a hard time, but straight Medicare still pays for the 3 to 5 times a week psychotherapy. We don't have a national health service like most of the countries I visit in Europe, but Medicare still can subsidize frequent sessions. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I would start out and say that what you just heard is also at the very beginning there about having a diverse background to begin with gives you a good base then to be able to go in various directions later on. So I would agree that the work I spent in hospitals and the work I did as far as going out and doing assessments out in the community at jails and all of that type of stuff in community mental health was a very strong basis to then be able to work past there into where you wanted to go after there. My own specialty is to incorporate in the spirituality side along with the mental health side, to really consider both of those dimensions of a person together when I'm actually working with someone or working with a couple or working with a family unit. Whatever unit I'm working with, to make sure that I'm getting the spiritual part in there, both to be able to assess to what degree the spiritual dimension may be part of the problem they're experiencing, also the way in which it provides strengths that are going to be strengths that they can draw upon as they're trying to find ways forward and moving past where they're already at. And then sometimes just where it's an important part of who they are to be able to be incorporated just on its own, separate from necessarily the key presenting problems that they're coming out and they're working there. When Tyler and I talked about this panel and we were talking about things, I think one of the key things in getting into private practice is to really think about why you're wanting to get into private practice and what you're wanting to be able to get out of private practice. Because if you don't think about that ahead of time, you really can't judge whether you're being successful or not. I've had people who've approached me, actually more on the marriage and family therapy side than on the mental health counseling side, who have told me, your practice is not successful. You're only supporting yourself part-time in your practice. If your practice was successful, you would have a full-time practice and you'd have more than enough clients to be able to take me on as a limited person and have all these extra clients sitting around possible there. And based upon some people's idea of what being a successful practice being, that would be the appropriate measures to use. However, for myself, I'm looking at a different way. I'm looking about who can I affect there, but also I'm looking at myself in the same sense and saying, what do I particularly want out of practicing? And I'm not wanting to practice full-time as a counselor or as a therapist. For myself, what I've learned to be the most healthy thing for myself is to have a balance of things, and in that balance to find the right balance that can work for me, that then leads to a satisfaction inside of that balance. So doing the work in the church and balancing that with the counseling practice and balancing that sometimes with some teaching and having all of those together, for me, makes it to be something that I can then look at and say, there is success here. Now, at times, I can actually say I don't have success because I have too many people coming in to want to see me. That can actually be not successful also, if you think about it. Because that means you're now finding people who, do you have another resource locally close by where you can actually refer that person to where they can actually get in? And some of the other places that do some of the spiritual integration, sometimes when I call them up, said, well, yeah, we have a 3-month waiting list for that person. And that, to me, then is a lack of success as far as doing that dimension of what I'm doing there. So it's a lot of things trying to work together about what for you is going to be your own criteria to say that you've actually reached where you want to reach. And so I think that's one of the things that I would sort of leave us with when we're thinking about success also.
Okay, thank you. Well, you're going to hear another side of the How many of you in the audience are licensed at this point? Okay, so some, and I was sort of assuming as many of the other NYMHCA meetings generally are, many graduate students. I'm not so sure, I don't see too many familiar faces from my current graduate student class. I see one new student coming into the program. So I was sort of assuming most of us, or many of you would be recent grads who are sort of in your developmental stage and kind of thinking about, what's private practice going to be like. So in view of that, I'm going to have a little bit of a different approach. When Tyler asked me to sit on this panel and talk about developing a private practice, I was thinking about how my practice began and the state of the field today. So in order to be sort of up to date on what is the state of the field today, I registered for a course that's been offered through the Networker for Psychotherapy. Are some of you familiar with Networker?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a great resource, Networker for Psychotherapy, and they run gazillions of these sort of webinar sessions where they'll bring 6 experts together, each have 1 hour, and you can listen to it whenever you like. So I decided I'm going to listen to the one they're doing on developing your private practice. I thought that was really important. And so I registered for this webinar course, and I've completed 4 of the 6 sessions. So I feel like right now I have a pretty good sense, at least according to the experts on the Networker, about where private practice is today and nationally. And I have to tell you that the picture is very different from my own professional history and trajectory in private work. When I completed my degree here at NYU, I was fortunate to land a job at Metropolitan Hospital in the psychiatric OPD. And like Dr. Kohler, Brian, wonderful, wonderful training ground, probably one of the best training grounds you could possibly have, because you get to see everybody and every diagnosis. And I was very, very fortunate to work in a multidisciplinary team and really get some additional training. And it was a terrific, great place to learn and grow as a clinician. I also, at the same time, entered a Psychoanalytic Training Institute, AIPP, and in 1980, just about ready to complete my psychoanalytic training and get my fellow and my nice plaque, I honed my shingle, so to speak. I actually ordered 200 business cards and began seeing private patients, and so I launched my private practice. I was receiving between $5 and $10 per session for the patients that the Institute would send to me, and that was a good beginning. And I was one of those fortunate people who did not have a huge student loan debt. In fact, I didn't have any student loan debt. That's another story. I know, facts. No student loan debt, and I was married at the time, and my income was not what we were living on, so I was a really lucky lady. And so my $5 to $10 was pretty much okay. I was getting experience, and I was getting my supervision and so forth. And I made somewhat of a positive impression on a number of the psychiatrists at Met, and so I began receiving some referrals from them. And in addition, I was fortunate when patients told other patients, and pretty soon I had a growing practice. That's how practice happened in those days. It sort of happened automatically. And it was kind of, if you build it, they will come mentality, and it did. And I didn't ever have to sit down and really think about how it was going to go. This just is not the case any longer, and it just doesn't work that way in today's mental health marketplace. So I won't tell you what I did, but rather I'm going to tell you more about what I think you need to be doing to make a go of things in today's current mental health world. First of all, and I'm going to be somewhat different from, and this is Christopher, from Christopher. I think you have to think more business-like, with a more business-like manner, and that was a real paradigm shift for me. Just even thinking about it over the last 4 weeks has been like sort of mind-boggling. In some ways, I thank Tyler for getting me into this situation, because I've watched my own private practice slowly decline over the last couple of years, and I've wondered a little bit about what might account for that decline. Now I understand a little bit better why my practice has declined the way it has. It's not my clinical skills, but my mindset that needs to be changed, and if I'm to maintain and grow my practice. Let's look at some of the issues that we're dealing with. A declining market share, frequency and fee, less frequency, less fees. The trend is shifting and has shifted from psychotherapy to medication. And I'm really talking about, because I'm looking at all the sessions that I was privy to in this webinar, I'm talking more nationally. Let's not only look at New York City. It's a very unusual place, so don't think only New York City. The field is compelling. So schools are graduating people in droves. This is a personal issue of mine. I've discussed it at every NYMHCA meeting. I've talked to Judy Ritterman about it. I've talked to other institutions. I think we're doing a disservice. We all need to survive, and that's where my major salary comes from. I'm full-time here at NYU, so we continue to graduate people in droves, so the competition is fierce. The costs of doing business, rents, advertising, all the other items along with that continue to go up while fees continue to go down, and they are going down dramatically. So what do you need to do? The points that were very strongly made in so many of these sessions is that we now have a much more educated consumer base, meaning that we are going to need to reach people who want your service. How do you do that? Well, in the old days, referrals were sort of the way you did it, and people asked other people, who do you see? That's who I'll see, kind of thing. Not so much anymore. People go to the internet. That's where they're looking. That's where they find their information. That's where they make decisions about who they're going to see. Also based on the fact that they have insurance. So they're looking at people who are on their insurance panels, and that becomes all internet and web-based search. I'm not a technology person. All of you are probably a million times better at it than I am, so I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the technology. But understand that if you're going to get into a private practice, you're going to need a website. You're going to need to know the technology, to have that available, and to get very, very good at placing your material in a place where people who are looking for you can find you. So it's got to be compelling, dynamic, targeted. You know, I'm still working off of a 34-year-old referral base, so now you know why I'm still in trouble. So how did I get stuck? I continue to believe that therapy was a vocation, and in this regard, I felt a lot like Christopher. Therapy was my vocation, it was a calling, as opposed to an occupation and a way to earn a living. I never had to really depend on my practice to earn a living, so that gave me a lot of latitude. My graduates, many of whom are now getting licensed and are struggling, are depending upon that practice to make a living. And so, because the job market is so difficult that this becomes a living in their practice. So I was fortunate in those days. I didn't have to depend on time. For those of you that do, it's a very different picture. I always maintained a regular job, and in addition, had a private practice as a secondary earning stream. And so I could be much more about helping, and I was privileged in that way. So many of us continue to think that way, and we get stuck. We don't choose the profession in order to run a successful business. That's what Chris was saying. We don't choose this profession to be a successful business person. I think some of you want to be successful business people and you want to make a living at it. You have to think business. This is not a hobby. I think I had a hobby mentality a little bit. It was always my sideline. It was something I did on the side. I think you need to have a business plan. Lynn Grodsky, who was one of the people in the network or webinar, talks a lot about that as business, and she's a business coach for therapists and author of Crisis Proof Your Practice. So it's a very different mindset and a different perspective. Look at what's happening. If you are already in practice, you've got to review where your referrals coming from, how's your business this year as opposed to last year, and if you're on board to make changes, what are those changes going to be? What will they require? Because they do require time and energy. That's where I'm not sure if I'm still on board for the time and energy because I do work full time. Okay. Branding. This was a word that the first time I heard it, I thought I would throw up. Branding, what am I, Diet Coke? I was horrified. It seemed sacrilegious to consider therapy like a product. I worked from the heart, I was a clinician, I gave time, I gave extra time, I did all the things that many of us feel so passionate about, but then you see fewer people and your range of service is not going to be as broad, and you have to start to consider, what is my brand? Who do I want to see? What's the population and the audience that I'm going to target? And also, I know why we're going to have just a few minutes and then we can talk more. I think as mental health counselors, we run a double-edged dilemma. We are non-recognizable. Our professional title does not appear in our name, unlike our social worker friends, and or nor our PhD brothers and sisters. So that we're neither doctor, we're not social worker, so there's a real dilemma about recognition in the marketplace. That's something we have to tackle by really dealing with that in a very strong way in order to educate your consumer. That's where the branding comes in. That's where your websites come in. That's where really being able to invite people in and let them know who and what you are and what is unique about you. Niche practices can be very helpful. I think everyone ought to consider where is your passion, where's your focus, where might your niche be, and what might you need to additionally study in order to have that niche. And I'm going to sort of conclude on that. I think a master's degree is a beginning. I tell my students this all of the time. This is a great starting point. Now where are you going to go to get your additional training? And maybe thinking in terms of a niche. Do you want to work with trauma? Are you interested in adolescence? Where do you want to be? And then start to direct your additional training, whether it's a psychotherapy institute or a family institute. Where do you want to be in that niche? So we can talk more about it. I can answer some more of your questions as we continue, and I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Great segue. Because when I talk, sort of off the top of my, and I apologize for being late. MTA is not cooperating with me. I don't know why. But my talk is really about developing your self-worth in your practice, and it's I think all the points made by the speaker so far are really excellent. It's it's a different era. I mean, it's a different era from when I started training. I started my doctoral degree in 1988, and the field of mental health started to change dramatically. So I tell my students, I teach in a mental health counseling program, a master's degree is like the tasting samples at the supermarket. You get a little taste of this, you get a taste of that, but that doesn't mean you can really cook. So you need to go and do something more. I didn't think with a PhD it was enough. I felt like a PhD was like Thomas. I had lots of different things, and I had sort of a good base to get a job and so forth, but it really wasn't enough. I think you need to find training, and certainly the experiences of training now are so different. When I trained, I would have one supervisor for every 2 to 3 patients I saw in any setting I was in. So that when I graduated, I had lots of supervisory time under my belt. That's no longer the case. I speak with students who tell me that they have one supervisor and they see 15 or 20 patients in their placements. Or they work at a job and they see 30 patient hours and they only get 1 hour supervision. What kind of training? You're basically doing paperwork, and you're kind of managing. So I think that in order to be successful in your practice, to give you the tools, because you can sort of find patients, How do you engage a patient and demonstrate to a patient, this is what I can offer you? Kind of along the idea of a niche and whether you brand yourself or not, but you really need to have that model of mind, what we call psychoanalysis, a model of mind, so that you can work from and you can offer that to patients, so that when you do an extended assessment, you can say to a patient, listen, this is what I hear. This is where I see your difficulties, and this is how I work and how I think I could help you, if we can work together. What do you think? I have to tell you that people feel understood, hope, and they feel like, oh, you know what you're doing, okay. So I think that's critical. I think also private practice can be a very isolated place, and you can easily trick yourself into, I'm just so great, I know what I'm doing, you know? And get into ethical pitfalls. Because, you know, people come to us with a lot of emotional difficulty, and we can easily get lost in it and not realize, even under best intentions, to do something that may not be helpful. And I think this is where supervision, colleagues, you know, that is very helpful, so you can sort of always have a check. And why am I doing what I'm doing? Because something that is seemingly nice, giving your patient extra time, extra phone calls, whatever, can ultimately actually be counterproductive to the treatment and to the patient. I think likewise in training you have a professional home base. You know, you graduate from your graduate programs, you're kind of floating out there in the universe. I think when you train at some institute, or you know, you always have a place that you can go back to. You can go back to training, you can go back to seeing your colleagues, you can go for seminars and so forth, and constantly sort of refuel yourself and learn. And it's a way to have access to referrals. People, you know, I get a lot of referrals, even if it's through insurance, but they've contacted somebody, and somebody has looked at them and say, oh, I know her, go to her. You know, so even though it's an insurance, they've come to me because somebody knows my work and refers me, and that means something to a patient, as opposed to just a Joe Schmo on the list that they don't know about. I think it's also, training helps you along the lines to what Christopher was saying, kind of have clarity for yourself, why are you doing this, you know, and to work on yourself. Most training programs, you have to be in your own treatment, which I think is crucial in this field. And so it helps you sort of consolidate the work on yourself, the theoretical foundation that you need, and the clinical training piece, so that you really integrate all those elements to help you be successful at what you do. And successful, I mean, in terms of engaging your patients and seeing your patients make progress in the work. I think personally, I like doing different things, you know, so I have a private practice, which is, I guess, fairly full-time, but I'm very active in the institute, I teach, and all of those things keep me in different ways, but also keep my skills very active, because in teaching, I have to think about the concepts and what I'm doing when I'm teaching them to students, and that helps me kind of rethink when I go back to my office and like, okay, what am I doing with this or that patient, you know? Likewise, my own, I'm still in analysis, I go there, you know, all of these avenues help kind of keep me in check. It's like an athlete, you know, just because they won the gold medal doesn't mean they go like, all right, until the next Olympics, you know, see me then. They keep training, right? And the coaches keep pushing them, because you need to, you know, your instrument is yourself. And to do this well, you need to constantly work on yourself. So I want a handout with some ideas of places you can check out on the web, and of course some materials from my institute. So, but anyway, so I'll leave you guys with that. Thank you.
Can we have a round of applause for So we're going to do a question and answer period now. There's a lot of us here, and thank you all for being here. Maybe we could have hands go up if people have questions. And you can ask the question broadly or ask questions specifically for one of our great speakers. Ready, go. Okay, I'll go first, but I expect you all to come with a question. So you all come from different backgrounds and different interests, and I'm wondering, people keep asking me, oh, what clientele do you want to work with? What population do you want to work with? And I want to work with all populations. But more and more what I hear is that it's good to have a niche. And you can have a couple of niches. But maybe broadly to the group, if a couple of people want to just tell me how they chose their niche. Right?
It's kind of like, do you choose it or did it choose you? In my case, it sort of chose me. My first patient actually was the partner of a woman who was in therapy with one of my supervisors. And she said, you're ready to get started, and I'll supervise you, and whatever, or there was some connection. And she said, this woman is this woman's partner. And so I started seeing her. My office would, at that time, I lived always in the Village, and my office was in the West Village, and this woman being gay, I became developed a gay network. And I started to see a great many gay and lesbian clients. And so I did a lot of homework and did a lot of supervision and read extensively, and that little niche sort of found me. The other was because there were some addiction issues, and that actually I had worked in addictions at Beth Israel Hospital, and so that became another little venue, which was working with people who had addiction issues and who were in recovery, in some form of recovery. So those two kind of focus areas evolved out of, they sort of found themselves, and I was comfortable with the addictions in particular because I had done a lot of, and I was working in the addiction field, so that sort of both found me and I found it. But the other was sort of by chance. So, but it was something that I sort of grew to really enjoy, and other than that, couples work. I knew I didn't want to work with youngsters or adolescents, and so I also did some additional training in couples.
Wonderful, thank you. Would someone else like to contribute how they found their niche, or how their niche found them?
Well, when you were raising the issue of the niche, though, you were raising populations. It's not necessarily populations that become the niche. So there's various types of niches. Populations are one type of niche, but there's other specialties that we'll get into that as far as there too. So the natural niche for me initially, from coming from a clergy background and one of my early supervisors was also a clergy person, was the area of spirituality, then becoming an area of a niche that way that then cuts across all of those other things people normally think of as niches. And the other thing I would say is that niches sometimes are your niches that become your niche throughout your career, which in that case, that particular niche is something that has. And there's other niches that sometimes are your niche for the time being. So when I was in community mental health, I became the only person for 2 counties who was the person who did adolescent substance abuse. You know, it's not something I really do a lot nowadays of, as adolescent substance abuse. It's not something that's necessarily a real passion of mine, but I was the only one in these 2 counties who was doing it. So every judge who had an adolescent that came before him automatically referred him into one of my groups or for me for individual work. And so that became a niche to then do. And particularly those second part of niches that we get, it's important if you sort of have one that just happens that way, that's not something that already has a big basis behind it, that you really get yourself in depth in that area to be ready to be able to work in that niche and to be able to have the qualifications to be able to do that with good supervision and with good training and all those other things that go around it.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you both. Who might have it? I see some hands. You in the back, sir. Thank you.
My name is Arvin Edwards, and I work at Metropolitan Hospital. So thank you, I'm glad you spoke about it.
My alma mater.
It's definitely an introduction to the profession.
Oh.
You will never forget.
Never.
You work with a diverse population. My question is, continuing education, what y'all were talking about, how do you finance continuing education when burdened with continued loan and not being able to reduce the loan debt effectively?
Well, I remember when I went for analytic training, I was working at Rockland Psychiatric Hospital up in Rockland County, and they paid for some part of it. Sometimes institutions will give you some money to pay, and I know now at NYU postdoc they have scholarships. Some wealthy people left money, so some of the training institutes have scholarships for people. And I just, ever since I've been a little teenager, I've worked long hours. So, I've always had 2 jobs, and in a way you stretch yourself, you give up having a life in some ways, but, it's, if you're doing what you love to do, it really isn't work. I mean, sometimes I really can't stand what I do when I'm working with patients who become threatening, or they start getting really very psychotic and you get a lot of phone calls. It's very hard. But overall, if you're doing what you love to do, someone said something about it found them. Was that you?
Yes.
I said, yeah, that's exactly what happened. If you work with people like you work with at the hospital, which I'm sure you're doing, if you want to do private practice with those people, and I did because that's what I was doing for so many years, from early 70s actually, somehow things just fell into place, and for me personally, just in the networks I was in, I became known as someone who worked with psychotic anxieties, and so a lot of mental health professionals sought me out, and so part of my practice is with psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and those people really helped me because I was able to afford to have the kind of practice I have. And if you could do that, have a diversity of people, some of the people who could afford a normal fee, subsidize the work with people who are poor. And, for me, I find that so enriching to be able to work with that range of people at different social economic status. And they both have really interesting problems. And so someone also said something about isolating in private practice. That is so true. If you do just full-time private practice, it's really hard. It's not, I don't think it's healthy actually. So if you can mix it up with the training, or that's why I mentioned about the peer support or peer supervision, or teach or consult, where you're not just doing individual psychotherapy. It's so important to have that mix.
I think if you have some of these skills, I don't want to also suggest that having a master's degree means you can't do anything yet. I think you are prepared to get started, and you have some specialty skills if you're in addictions or if you're in one of the other areas. You can start. I think the key is that you have some supervision. One of the ways I always did, I was a supervisor, and I did group supervision. And so I could charge very, very little for the group because I was making enough because there were 5 or 6 students in the group. And I think group supervision, even peers, if you can't even afford a supervisor, but peer supervision, you're bringing the cases to other people, you're reviewing them. It's in that kind of sort of like your graduate seminar method. I think that can help you to get started and bridge until you feel like I'm ready for more advanced training. I think that can be awfully useful and not overly expensive.
I think finding out if the hospital pays, and most often many hospitals will pay for at least a portion of your training. You could also defer certain student loans when you're in training. You get a letter from the place you're training to do that. And in many places, you'll need to see patients as part of the work. So sometimes you can, see extra patients or whatever, and that might defray the cost. Many places, like I know the AIP, will work on a payment plan to make it feasible for a person to afford the training. So. If you go down the route of training, it certainly means that you work longer hours. I'm with you there. I don't think I've not worked on a weekend that I wasn't in New York for, I don't know, since 1988. So if you sort of expect that for the short term while you're in training, you're going to have really long days, but it'll be, for a limited time, but that it'll give you sort of this kind of. You can also start checking out places. You can go, you're really fortunate that you live in or are close to, if you're coming here to this presentation, in New York. during the academic year, there are countless seminars and workshops and scientific meetings, and some stuff that's free.
Oh,
And so I would
Absolutely.
suggest that like step one is go to those things and kind of see what feels right, what place seems like it could be nice, check out, and even in going to presentations like that, that's a way of educating yourself. So that I think that would be like step one, to sort of see what are places like, and then sort of ask, any institution is really happy to talk to you. And if you have questions about their training and the costs and this and that, so, I know people are really happy to sit down, so that would be my
Thank you all so much. I see more hands on the left, in the blue, please.
Hi, my name is Diana Kramer. So I was trying to ask, I know that I think you saw with at least 2 doctors. I didn't remember if you got a doctor or not. And I know Corinne, you.
I know Diana, no.
So I just wanted to know if you guys have any ideas about differences between developing practices for master's level clinicians versus doctoral clinicians, because I'm seeing a few major differences. I just graduated this May, and that's a huge concern moving forward. So, and just as a springboard, that's sort of my question.
If there's a couple of people who'd like to answer that question.
What was it?
About pursuing a doctorate and.
Or just developing a practice at a
Developing a
master's
practice,
level
master's
versus a
level.
doctoral level.
I'll throw out a few thoughts as a master's person, because Diane's one of our graduates. Diana. There was a statistic on on the webinar today that 85% of people who will be in psychotherapy across the country will be subdoctoral. So in other words, are working with master's level people. That's in the country. As I said, cautioned you earlier, don't put the New York City blinders on. Think nationally, because this is an enigma in New York City. So most people outside New York City, I think, are being seen by master's level practitioners, largely because of managed care. And with Obamacare and the access to health care for 30 million more people will be seen by master's level people. So the expanse is really there. One also has to balance the additional cost to pursue a doctoral program, the cost of the program, and the years that you might be delaying earning potential. And it's kind of a cost-benefit ratio. And what it is you want to do other than to carry additional initials behind your name. Many of the doctoral programs, like ours at NYU here, is really very, very research focused and is really preparing, although it's a scientist practitioner model, is a very strong scientist and a little less practitioner. So be thinking about some of those things.
Go ahead. I really think it depends on what you want to do. I think that you can develop a really good practice, but I think you need to develop yourself. Because especially with the MHC degree, it's fairly new still, and so it's not as well known. So that's why I think for those of you that have the MHC, it is in your best interest to sort of affiliate in some way with other institutions, both for your own training, but also for that affiliation and sort of having that face time. But I think you can be quite successful, and you can get those additional certifications in ways actually that sort of provide more bang for your buck in terms of private practice growth. As opposed to going and getting a doctorate, which you still, if you get a doctorate in PhD, you want to be a licensed, you still have to go a year after and work, so it sort of delays you, and so those 3 or 4 or 5 years, you could have been establishing a practice. Getting training in an institute, in some other institution, not spending as much money as it would to get a doctorate, and having by those 5 years a very thriving practice and maybe doing other things, supervising, etc. Because there are a lot of master's level people doing psychotherapy, but I think I don't think there are shortcuts to the fact that you have to develop yourself in some way and invest. But I think that in the long run, you could, develop, a good practice with a master's degree.
The other thing I think is thinking not only about where we're at now. I mean, I think you did a good job of talking about where it's changed in the last 20 years, the field, and it varies state by state too, as far as some of these things are concerned as well. But where is it going to be in 20 years' time also, and what niche and what population are you really wanting to work with? So my practice is right on the border of Harlem and Washington Heights. The majority of the population around me want to use Medicaid. And as a professional corporation with mental health counseling, I cannot accept Medicaid, so I cannot serve that population. So if I see that as being the population I'm going to be serving long term, then I have a problem as a master's level clinician to be able to do that. So I mean, it depends. You've got to be thinking also, where is it going to be going farther out as you keep going, as you try to answer that question.
An additional thing that's happening in the field right now, particularly if people have Medicaid, you've probably heard of it, health homes. Yeah, the field is radically changing. I was just at a meeting last week up at Fordham with the Jewish Board for Family and Children's Services, and we were talking about some of the changes. But they've been announcing these slowly. New York State is kind of slow to convert. We've been taking more time. We've converted from CBT, continuing day treatment, to PROS. It's PROS now. But now Medicaid, you're going to have to be, if they're instituting this as they're planning to, you're going to have to be registered with a health home. A health home is not a geographic location. They're going to have contracts with agencies, and people are going to have to, there's going to be capitation, a certain amount of money given to that particular patient. And so if you're servicing Medicaid patients, you're going to have to be registered with a health home affiliation. The other thing, case managers are going to be hired. In fact, ICMs now are going to be called case managers, and they're going to be managing a large number of people. But what went through my mind, I think, from what I'm seeing in the field, is, first of all, the MSWs really led the way, I think, in having master's level private practice. So we need them, we need master's level people. The mental health needs are so strong and so extensive today. The increasing rates of psychiatric disorders, for pediatric bipolar disorder is just one example, but bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. So I would look into, if it were me just starting now, and the field is very different from when we started, evidence-based, becoming trained. If you want a niche, I think it's very helpful. DBT, people are doing that privately, not just at Metropolitan Hospital, St. Luke's. They all have postgraduate center. They all have DBT programs. But there are also private practitioners doing DBT groups and individual DBT. The other thing is motivational interviewing. And of course, CBT is always something that's highly regarded. So I would, there are others. There are other evidence-based psychosocial treatments. But I would think about getting some training in that and advertising yourself as having this training. And going to all the meetings and letting your work be known, writing, publishing, giving talks at a local library. But I think publishing is also, if you could, there's a mental NYMHCA journal, publishing, writing, and because I know I write a lot and I get referrals from people who read an article and they contact me or something. But evidence-based.
Thank you.
I just wanted to suggest one other thought, since you're in business.